What does it mean to steal another writer's work? Jean Hanff Korelitz joins us to talk about her new novel, The Plot. Have Black uprisings been mischaracterized in this country as street riots? Elizabeth Hinton will be here to discuss her new book, America on Fire. Elizabeth Harris will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's May 28th. I'm Pamela Paul. Jean Hanff Korelitz joins us now from New York. Her latest book is called The Plot. Jean, thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with the premise of this book. And I want to say up front, there are a number of big twists, plot twists in this book, and we are not going to give away anything. So if you haven't read the book, please don't fear. We will not ruin it for you. But give us the premise.
The novel is about a writer who I think we can safely say has failed, is failing, is well on his way to complete obscurity. And he is teaching in a pretty bottom of the barrel MFA program, a low residency MFA program, and into his classroom and into his depression about his life walks just the worst of all possible students. He's arrogant, he's dismissive, he has no time for anybody, especially his teacher, Jake. And he basically says, I don't need any of you people because I am writing this great novel that is going to be so successful that all of the good things that we in the book world are aware of are going to happen to this novel. And Jake, of course, dismisses this as the arrogance of the young and the early career writer, the untried writer. But then during a private conference, he actually hears this plot. And he unfortunately realizes that everything that this guy has said is going to come true. Some years later, when he's even closer to the terminus of his own career, he discovers that this young man has died and has died pretty soon after their encounter. Ergo, there is no book. There is not even a manuscript. There is only this story. And as any writer would agree, this is a story that has to be told. So he writes his own novel with this story and all of the good things that his former student has predicted come true. But he can't really enjoy it because he's so terrified that somebody is going to step out of the shadows and accuse him. And then somebody does. And the rest of the novel is really about his trying to steer clear of this person, try to avoid the disaster that this person represents for his professional life and his personal life, and also ultimately to find out who this person is and where this story came from.
Okay, there's a lot here to discuss, including the many layers of the term the plot. And your basic setup plot, where the guy steals someone else's story, is obviously just a classic plot. And then you go and invert it and play with that in several different ways. It's a really fun book for those of us in the book world, of course. And one cannot help, or at least this reader could not help, but guess, well, I wonder what third-tier MFA program, low residency MFA program this is. Let's see. It's in Vermont, and it's kind of like this, and it's kind of like that. I mean, did you just have a lot of fun playing with the writer world of this book?
I had so much fun. I did. Look, I'm in the writer world. I am a writer. I did work in publishing at one point. I worked it for our Strauss and Giroux for a critical year. It was the year of Bonfire of the Vanities and Presumed Innocent. And I'm married to a writer who is in the academic world. I personally did not get an MFA, but I have friends who loved their MFA experiences and felt that they were transformative. I have a close friend who did a low residency MFA and absolutely loved it. So I hope I am not, the boogeyman dissing the MFA world. But in this case, this is a pretty bargain basement MFA program.
The New York Times Book Review plays a tiny little role here, and your hero, Jacob Finch Bonner, or your protagonist, maybe is a better term, has his first book is a new and noteworthy in the New York Times Book Review, and that's kind of the peak of his career.
It is not a small peak. It's a great peak, but it is his only peak.
Right, right.
It's interesting because some of the reviews of this book have characterized Jacob Finch Bonner as a one-hit wonder or a writer who's trying to reattain the heights of his great success. He never had any success, really. I mean, even at the time of his new and noteworthy first novel, which actually I have to credit my wonderful agent Suzanne Gluck for helping me title this book. His novel is called The Invention of Wonder, which is really kind of the generic
right.
It's
terrible.
It means nothing, The Invention of Wonder. But even at the height of this great success with The Invention of Wonder, he's still going to give a reading at Barnes & Noble and 3 people turn up and 2 of them are his parents, which is the great leveler for all of us writers. With very few exceptions, we are lucky to get anybody to turn up at a bookstore to hear us read.
Right. Torture for most people. You had to come up with 2 plots, really, in this book, the plot of the book, and then there's, of course, a book within a book. Which did you come up with first?
One of the more interesting questions I've been asked in the last couple of weeks is, why didn't you just write Jake's novel? And the answer is that both things came together. I've always been interested in plagiarism and theft of all kinds, but we're writers, so for us, theft is plagiarism. It came together that he had stolen this plot, and what could this plot possibly be? What have we never seen before? And it just kind of came to me. It just sort of popped into my head, and I thought, as one occasionally does, if one is extremely fortunate, yeah, that. And that, the wallop of these 2 things together set the novel in motion.
And you aren't even lightly tempted to go and write that book?
No, in fact, I tried not to write the excerpts. I originally turned in my manuscript without any of these chapters of Jake's novel, which is called Crib.
Also a double meaning, which is great.
Of course, yes, a double meaning. Because I was in the middle of writing the book during the lockdown last year, and I heard a podcast with Lily King, who had also just published a novel about a novelist, in which the novel that the character's writing is wonderfully successful. And somebody asked her, why didn't you give us a taste of this novel? And she said quite sensibly, well, I couldn't imagine that anything I would write would be great enough to persuade the reader that it was worth all of this publishing hoopla. And I thought, terrific. Lily King's not writing hers. I don't have to write mine. So I turned in the novel without them. And my very wise editor said, you
can't get away with that.
Right. So I really wrote them all in a kind of daisy chain of chapters. And then I kind of layered them into the book because each chapter is a clue of its own. So
that must have been Lily King's Writers and Lovers that she was talking about.
That was, yes. Great book.
One of the fun things that you get to do then, you don't have to write that entire other book. You ended up inserting these chapters periodically throughout the main novel, and it skips around. I mean, that's a kind of interesting trick. It's almost a little bit TV-like in its jumping around in time.
Well, they are in order. They do jump through the novel.
But you get to skip ahead.
Exactly. I get to skip all the boring time passes kind of stuff and just zero in on these little scenes or insights that will move Jake's story forward. It wasn't easy. It was my least favorite part of writing this whole book. But
really?
Because you have to do it all again. It's like writing another novel. More characters and more names. There's that wonderful excerpt in Michael Chabon's Wonder Boys where this kind of washed up writer is thinking, oh my God, it's all so hard. All these family dynasties, all these place names, all these family wills and legacies. It's just too much trouble.
So if that was your least favorite part, what was your favorite part of writing?
My favorite part of writing the book was that I was writing it because we were in the middle of an absolute global nightmare. And I'm a person who has always run in the other direction from any kind of apocalyptic scenario ever since I was completely traumatized by watching The Omega Man as a child. And I was so scared by what was happening. It's a scary
title.
The Omega Man?
Yes.
I mean, I still have nightmares about it. That's not an exaggeration. I have no idea what my parents thought they were doing taking me to that movie. But ever since then, I read Laurie Garrett's nonfiction book, The Coming Plague, many years ago. I was scared from the fall of 2019, And by March of 2020, I was so grateful to have this work, to be able to get up in the morning and completely check out of reality and write this book. That was, without question, my favorite part of this entire experience.
Did you come up with the idea during the pandemic, or was this something that gestated before that?
No, it's actually a very strange story. I had been working on a very different book, not a suspense type of book at all. And it was not quite coming together. And I was literally in my editor's office having a very unpleasant meeting about why she was not going to buy this book. When I said, I actually have this other idea. And it wasn't even a fully formed idea. It was just in the process of coming together. But I narrated this whole novel called The Plot to her. And by the end of the meeting, we had basically come up with a new plan, which was that I would put aside the other novel, which I'm now working on for publication next year, and write this crazy story that I just come up with. And then everything shut down. And there I was in a very remote place with my husband in a house in upstate New York and just working nonstop. So I wrote it really over 3 or 4 months.
I think this will surprise listeners who are familiar with your work. You are not a one-hit wonder. This is not your first novel. You've written several novels: The Sabbath Day River, A Jury of Her Peers, The White Rose, The Devil and Webster. 2 of your books have been adapted for the screen. You Should Have Known became The Undoing with Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant on HBO, and Admission was turned into a Tina Fey movie. So it feels kind of shocking that here you are, all the success, you wrote this novel, and your editor was actually saying to you, we're not going to publish this book?
Absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And people have this idea about literary careers, even careers in which some very nice things have happened, that they are, they're solid and they're, nothing bad can happen to them, that we're coasting. Nothing could be farther from the truth. To have gotten to book number 7 without ever having had an enormously successful novel, to me, is the great accomplishment of my life, that I kept going. And, I absolutely acknowledge the support that I've had from my agent who believed in me and my editor who believed in me. But, if I had walked into anybody else, any other office, I think, with my sales numbers of my past books, no, I don't think anybody would have taken a chance on The Plot.
So the story of this unsuccessful writer then perhaps was a little bit closer to home in its way.
Jake is all of us. I mean, yeah. I used to regard other people's literary careers with great curiosity. I used to have this little private parlor game. Would I want that person's career? Would I want that person's career? And those names have changed over the years as careers have faltered, disappeared. I've been publishing for a very long time, and my contemporaries in the 1990s were people with massive successes who have not been heard of now for 10, 15 years. So, it's very much a tortoise and hare kind of thing in my own case.
Yes, brutal. But I mean, it does seem like at the very least, writing and ideas could have come to you. I don't know if easily is the word, but you have another book coming out in 2022. I don't feel like it was that long ago that You Should Have Known came out. Is writing for you something that you kind of struggle with, desperately search for ideas, or does it feel like it's a natural, relatively easy process?
I have noted the pattern in looking back over all of the books that I've written, some of which, again, were not published. It takes about 3 or 4 years, and then there's this kind of period of enforced rest, which you can choose to either be terrified about, oh my God, I'll never write again, or you can say, this is how it works. I'm just going to read 50 books now and go to 100 movies and go to the flea market. And then one day you think, that would be interesting. And then you kind of chew it over for a while. And then one day there's this kind of anxiety about getting it down before you forget it. And that's when you start. And once you start it, you have to finish. And it may take 2 years or 3 years.
I want to talk about the central idea in this book because it is fascinating. And you said you've always been interested in plagiarism. I think every writer probably is, at least luridly fascinated with this. But it's a really interesting, more complicated idea than stealing a loaf of bread, say. So explain what your fascination was and the fuzzy lines that come with stealing ideas and intellectual property.
There are two great rivers of anxiety that meet in every author. One has to do with being stolen from. And we know that plagiarism happens, but it's also true that accusations of plagiarism happen even more than plagiarism happens, and that we're all incredibly vulnerable to that. And the list of great authors who have been accused of plagiarism, all you have to do is Google authors who've been accused of plagiarism, as I did during the writing of this book, and you see shocking names. But it doesn't take much to accuse somebody. I mean, Stephen King and Joyce Carol Oates were accused by the same deranged woman of entering her home and photographing the papers on her desk. And ergo, they are on that list. It had no merit. Somebody self-published a book called Harry and the Muggles. So now J.K. Rowling is on that list of people accused of plagiarism. But we may know that those accusations are not true. We may know that we haven't done it, but we feel extremely vulnerable. The other side of the coin is that most writers, I feel, have a deep anxiety that they themselves are plagiarizing
without knowing it.
Without knowing it. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that we are readers and we read compulsively and we've read for many years. And all of those things that we have read, whether it was Dick and Jane or, Christopher Hitchens or whatever it is, it's all rattling around in there. And we may have forgotten where some sentences came from, where some ideas came from. And when we write, it comes out, and it comes out in ways that feel so familiar that we may actually believe that we wrote them. So there is this deep terror that we're going to publish a book, and out of nowhere will come, j'accuse, saying, I wrote that line, or that was my idea, or that was my story. Again, we as writers also acknowledge that we are drawing from a well that pre-exists us, that will go on long after we stop writing and living. And this has produced, the great novels, the great poems, the great movies, the great plays, the great everything. And if we start kind of legislating who gets to lower their bucket into the well, then we are going to disqualify some of the great works of art, and we can't do that. So it's all a mishmash, and the only thing that unites all of us writers on these issues is terror. And I think the fear is what percolates through Jake and the novel.
One last question. In addition to writing novels, you run something called Book the Writer.
I do.
What is that?
Book the Writer is something that I've run in New York City since 2015, and we have these book groups with authors. You sign up on our website, you buy the book, you read the book, and then you walk into somebody's apartment, and the author is there, and there are about 20 other people, and you talk about the book. And in the middle of the pandemic, I kind of took a deep breath and went online. I was hoping to avoid doing that. The in-the-room experience is very important to us. To be sitting there with Elizabeth Strout, holding your copy of Olive Again and talking about how she wrote it and why she wrote it, that's really, really special. But when we went online, we were able to welcome people from literally all over the world, and that was pretty amazing as well. So as we prepare to go back into actual rooms in New York City this fall, I'm trying to figure out how to maintain some kind of online elements so that we don't lose some of these great readers who've been joining us during the pandemic.
That's like a lovely alternative to having 3 people show up at your bookstore reading.
Very much so. And I'm sometimes really amazed by the authors who say yes to this. You wouldn't think Elizabeth Strout would feel the need to come to somebody's living room and sit there with 20 people, but they're really wonderful conversations. And the fact that everybody's read the book and that everybody's chosen to be there, and nobody's there because somebody else in their book group made the book selection this month and they had to read it. They're very, very special events.
Can listeners book Jean Hanff Korelitz through Book the Writer?
They can absolutely contact me. I scheduled myself for a free event. I couldn't find my way to charging people for myself that I think I'm doing in June. It's on our Eventbrite page, but This fall, we're going to have Jhumpa Lahiri and Chang-Rae Lee and Edmund Duval. We have a great list this summer and this fall.
All right. Well, several of them previous guests on the podcast. Jean, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Jean Hanff Korelitz's new book is called The Plot. Joining us now to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review, Tina Jordan. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So, folks who were listening last week might remember that I referenced a 1914 interview from a British publisher in which he was bemoaning the fact that people's attention spans for books had become quite short thanks to things like tango and playing golf and motoring. And so this week I want to bring you something in the same vein, which is Sinclair Lewis's address to the American Booksellers Association in 1936. He, too, spoke about the enemies of books, and here's what he had to say. First of all, he started off by describing recent bestsellers as $1.50 packets of pink soap suds, and then he veered onto another tangent and said he declined to have his talk broadcast because he wanted merely to, quote, ramble around, unbound by the split-second timing and detestable custom of the radio, where I would be allowed exactly 12 minutes and 9 seconds in between the program of the Lollipop Lilters and the X-Lax Symphony Orchestra. So that's amusing enough. But anyway, then what he had to say actually really struck me. He said, I don't think that anything will altogether supplant the old-fashioned printed book. I don't believe that any nimble television apparatus, any series of phonograph records, any ingenious microscopic gadget whereby you can carry the entire works of Balzac in your cigarette case will ever take the place of books just as we know them. Right? So he's, I guess, predicting the future. But he concluded with something which actually spoke to my heart. He's talking again about the lure of the screen, which is something that the British publisher William Heinemann had been bemoaning decades earlier. And he said, I don't think that Hollywood can forever remain the New Jerusalem. There may be new gods, but I think most of you will say with me, as for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord in books.
Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Pamela.
Elizabeth Hinton joins us now from New Haven, where she is a professor of history, a professor in the Department of African American Studies, and also a professor of law at the law school. Her newest book is called America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. Elizabeth, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Pamela.
So I want to start with a question about your day job. I'm assuming the academic year is over now, but what was it like teaching this past year, both in a pandemic and in the wake of all of the events of 2020, very relevant to your book? And did it feel different? It's hard to imagine how it couldn't, but tell me.
It definitely felt different seeing all of my students in their little Hollywood Square boxes on Zoom and not being able to be with them in person, which I think was just really hard on all of us. But I taught an undergraduate seminar called Urban Inequality After Civil Rights and a graduate seminar called The American Carceral State, which looked at the kind of latest literature on policing and incarceration. And both of these courses were, of course, incredibly timely. And we very often situated the history and the text that we were discussing within the protests of last summer, but also in the current moment. The trial of Derek Chauvin was unfolding as we were in my undergraduate seminar doing the unit on mass criminalization. And for my students, questions about defunding and abolition were always at the forefront of their minds and at the forefront of much of the scholarship that we read.
Did that feel new? Does it feel like the interests and priorities or maybe the ideas that your students are thinking about have evolved in the past few years?
Well, that's one of the things that's really been amazing about doing this work. You know, my first book came out in 2016, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, which is a history of federal law enforcement policy. And it's just been incredible to see that widening interests in these issues and students who really want to confront the most pressing issues facing our society and to think about solutions and to think about what a different kind of world might look like. So I think for issues of mass criminalization, police violence, the future of public safety in the United States, these are some of the most pressing domestic issues of our time. And students are ready and eager to learn about these topics, especially to think about these topics historically and to think about, as they go out in the world, what solutions and alternatives might look like.
I'm interested in that for you as a professor of history, but also a professor of law, right? Because with history, you're sort of explaining where we're coming from, but historians, at least traditionally, have loathed to be prescriptive or to come up with policy. But with law, obviously, you do go into that. I'm curious how that balances out for you in your work.
Well, for me, history has always been about, and I became a historian in order to understand the past, understand how we got to where we are today in order to create a better present and future. And I think especially the history of racial inequality in the United States and the history of the development of policing as we know it and the advent of mass incarceration is just so important in terms of thinking about where policies might have gone wrong and understanding too that mass incarceration and the dynamics between police and communities of color that they're charged with protecting are the outcome of a set of decisions that were made at the highest level of government, but among local and state officials as well. And so if we can identify the patterns of the sets of decisions, then we can also think about how those decisions might be undone in order to create a more equitable and just society.
Let's talk about this new book. And you mentioned your previous book. I want to start there and how you got from that book to this one. So that book was From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. And the new book, obviously, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. Was there a very clear through line? Did you finish that book and then know that you were going to get started on this work? Or how did that transition for you?
This book certainly came out of the research that I did in the first book, but also some of the larger themes and dynamics I examine. And that is like, what was the impact of the launch of the War on Crime, which began in the mid-1960s, in the communities of color that the militarized police forces and the expansion of police patrol and surveillance most targeted. And so in some ways, America on Fire provides a community level perspective on the federal policies I examined in the book. But the persistence and the scale of rebellion itself and the fact that rebellion did not end with the 100-some protests that erupted after Martin Luther King was assassinated, as many of us thought, but continued well into the 70s, was something that I had observed over the course of my research for the first book, which was based mostly in White House central files of various presidential administrations. And I happened to gain access to an archive of local newspaper clippings that really allowed me to see just how pervasive and persistent urban rebellion was in not just big cities in the United States, but in mid-size and smaller cities and rural communities, and not just in urban centers in the North, but in through the South, through the West, the Rust Belt, the Sun Belt, throughout the entire United States. And those stories were not clear in the absence of these new underutilized sources when I wrote the first book.
Let's talk about some of those smaller scale, not the big Northeast city uprisings that we normally talk about. Let's talk about places like Cairo, Illinois, and York, Pennsylvania. Tell us just the story of one of these towns and what happened there.
Cairo and York are really important because in the case of York, for a city of its size, was arguably one of the most destructive rebellions of its era. It lasted for several weeks. It took the lives of a young mother and a police officer and caused significant property damage to the city. And the rebellion in Cairo, Illinois was the longest. It lasted it was sporadically from 1969 through 1972. And part of the reason why the violence there in both of those cities was so extreme was the deep entanglement between white vigilante groups and white power groups and the police department and political and economic elites in both cities. So in many ways, what happened in Cairo especially is a warning to all of us about what the consequences are when officials decide to use the police to manage the material consequences of socioeconomic exclusion and poverty. And instead of granting Black residents fundamental rights to kind of maintain and shore up white supremacy and to use the police to maintain those boundaries, which in the end, in the Cairo case, led to the economic deprivation of the town itself. So essentially, the white establishment in Cairo decided to, instead of giving Black residents rights, held on to a white supremacist political order that in the end destroyed the town itself. And this is a warning, I think, to all of us of what the disease of racism can do.
So what happened in Cairo for those who are not familiar with that town and that situation? How did the uprisings begin? What were people protesting? What was the extent of the violence? What were the consequences there?
So Cairo was a small town at the kind of southernmost tip of Illinois, or is a small town. And in the 1960s, just under half of the residents who lived there were Black, and they had no access to very many city jobs. Most of the residents, more than half, were relegated to a deteriorating housing project called Pyramid Courts. They had no political representation. And throughout the course of the 1960s, embraced the tactics of the mainstream civil rights movement through sit-ins and petitions and protests in order to attempt to gain access to decent jobs, educational opportunities, and to improve housing conditions in the city. And in 1967, after a Black veteran was mysteriously killed in the city jail, Black residents, as in many other cities in 1967, rose up in rebellion. And the response to that political violence was the kind of shoring up of white vigilante groups and involving both the kind of power brokers and elite businessmen of Cairo, but also white workers who essentially terrorized the Black community for years. I mean, literally, mobs of white men would stand on the Mississippi levee and shoot into the Pyramid Courts housing project, and Black residents, in turn, fought back. They engaged both in violent protests for self-protection, but also a boycott of the white businesses in Cairo, because from their perspective, why would they continue to patronize these institutions to allow white residents in the city to then purchase guns to fire at their community? So this struggle lasted for a number of years. And for me, it was the kind of pervasiveness of the nature of the white supremacist violence into the 1970s was admittedly somewhat surprising, because the sicking of German shepherds on young Black children and the general terror that the white vigilante mob inflicted on the community, with the full backing and support of the local police force, looks like what we think of as the Jim Crow South in Mississippi, and not a small town in Illinois in 1971.
I want to point to the words that you're using, because I think this is part of what you write about. There are all these terms that sometimes get used interchangeably, whether it's uprising, protest, civil unrest, civil disobedience, street violence, rebellion, riot. Explain the difference in what these terms mean, and specifically to why you choose the word rebellion and what it means that these kinds of situations have often been characterized as riots.
So following the first kind of major national incident of collective violence, which was in Harlem in 1964, in the summer of 1964, following the killing of a Black 15-year-old high school student by a New York City police officer, and Harlem, as many of us know, erupted for a number of days, and places like Chicago and Rochester, New York, where the National Guard had to be called, soon followed. Lyndon Johnson immediately made this distinction between what he called respectable civil rights protests and rioting, which for Johnson was criminal and senseless and linked to problems of juvenile delinquency and crime. And this view of rioting as criminal rather than as a political act really overlooked the fundamental socioeconomic root causes that drove people to feel like they had no other recourse to achieve demands that they shared with the mainstream civil rights movement, those who participated shared, right? Decent jobs, access to educational opportunities, full political and economic inclusion in American society. Instead of recognizing the drivers of rebellion, the larger drivers of rebellion, Johnson calls them criminal. And in doing so, then the only solution to the socioeconomic problems behind the political violence is more police. And so expanding the programs of the war on crime and embracing police as a solution to this political violence, we've been stuck ever since in this cycle where police are then deployed in a rebellion community to put down the very thing that residents are rebelling against. And so the terminology here and understanding these acts as political is extremely important if we're ever going to get out of this cycle.
So when we talk about the cycle of civilian violence as a response to police violence and as a response to these greater inequities, is the solution to address the inequities, to reform the police, or to avoid the civilian violence, or all of the above, or some combination thereof?
Part of it is that we have to go, if we want to get at the root causes, we have to go beyond the police because the root causes of the violence are not the police themselves, right? These incidents erupt in response to, most often in response to police force, and police are the most tangible expression of systemic racism in under-resourced, low-income communities. And the solution, policymakers and Johnson had it back in 1968. Johnson's own Kerner Commission, which he called in the middle of the rebellion in Detroit in 1967, had determined that if the United States wanted to address the root causes of Detroit and Newark and the hundreds of other cities that erupted, what was necessary was a massive infusion of resources beyond the war on poverty into low-income communities of color. It was a job creation program. It was expanded educational opportunities. And the Kerner Commission knew it then. Unfortunately, policymakers did not heed those recommendations and instead embraced the war on crime as a solution. And you have to wonder, what would the country look like today if that Marshall Plan for American cities, as members of the Kerner Commission suggested, would have actually come to fruition?
What happened to that 1968 Kerner Commission, to the recommendations made?
Unfortunately, the recommendations of the Kerner Commission that were taken up were those that reinforced the recommendations of another commission that Johnson called in the 1960s, the Crime Commission, which essentially developed a blueprint for the Safe Streets Act of 1968, which Johnson passed in June and launched the war on crime. And so even though many of the policing measures that the Kerner Commission called for emphasize the need to de-escalate force, police community relations programs for police officers to develop and sustain meaningful relationships with community members who they're charged with protecting, the calls for increased police force and increased police research and technology and professionalization and training were the elements of the Kerner Commission report that were taken up, not the larger socioeconomic programs that the commission had indeed put at the center of its set of recommendations for the federal government.
In what ways have historians misinterpreted this period, in your view? And I think we're talking largely, right, about 1968 to 1972.
Part of it is that we missed, and this is something that, admittedly, I was guilty of in my first book. I think lacking access to the historical sources, we really missed the scale and intensity of rebellion after the enactment of the Safe Streets Act in 1968 and after Martin Luther King's assassination. That is that as the militarization of American police and the expansion of police forces took off as a result of this unprecedented piece of federal legislation, communities not in the big cities who received federal grants earlier in the decades, like Los Angeles and New York and Detroit and Chicago, but smaller and rural cities like Cairo, Illinois, and York, Pennsylvania, and Harrisburg and Carver Ranchers, Florida, began to expand their police forces and militarize them with new surplus weapons from Vietnam and interventions in Latin America and Caribbean, like armored tanks and tear gas and bulletproof vests. When these new technologies and strategies hit in smaller and mid-sized cities where Black Americans were living in segregated and unequal conditions, their response was not to embrace these new crime control programs, but the immediate response was to fight back and contest them through political violence and through rebellion.
Was there an effort made at racial diversification of the police force, and in particular in terms of leadership positions? And if so, did that have any impact in communities where there was a greater diversification of the police, or did it not have any significant effect?
So that's a really important question, and actually one of the recommendations that the Kerner Commission made. And especially in the Johnson and Nixon era, the idea was that the best way to deal with police-community relations was to hire more officers of color. But of course, as we know, representation does not solve the systemic problems within police departments or fundamentally change the strategies of increasing patrol and surveillance in targeted low-income urban communities that guided the war on crime. As we see today, officers of color also engage in police violence against other people of color. Hiring more Black and brown faces in law enforcement positions and in high places doesn't necessarily solve the problems that are at the heart of policing in America.
Why is that?
Because we have to go beyond reform to deal with some of the fundamental problems and logics of policing. And that is one of the things that steered policing strategies in the United States historically, is that the kind of function of police in middle class, suburban, and white communities is to protect property from outsiders. And the function and purpose of police in low-income communities of color is to identify suspects, arrest them, and eventually remove them from the community. With these two differential strategies, especially in communities that suffer from higher rates of crime and social harm and violence, what residents really need is protection. They need to feel as though their communities are safe. And an outsider armed with a gun, often arresting people on arbitrary or misdemeanor charges, is not necessarily, or has proven to not necessarily, promote public safety in a meaningful way.
One of the current proposals that is getting a lot of attention around police response is this idea of defunding the police and looking at over-policing. And I'm curious if the Kerner Commission's report touched on that, or if the problems that those who advocate defunding the police didn't develop until after that 1968 commission.
Defunding the police, as I interpret it, is really about investing different kinds of resources into communities that suffer from high rates of poverty, unemployment, crime, and violence. And the Kerner Commission didn't use the terminology defund the police. Of course, this is a relatively new idea framed in that way. But the Kerner Commission did say, hey, if we want to actually address these problems, we've got to promote early childhood education. We've got to promote jobs and job training programs for people. We've got to give people access to healthcare. These are the programs that we need to be focused on if we want to deal with the problems of crime, public safety, and inequality in meaningful ways. And to me, that is what defund the police is all about. It's about investing in a different set of resources that, since the civil rights movement, we have consistently divested from.
Looking back on this period as an historian, what areas do you think need to be re-examined most? Obviously, you've gone back and looked at this period, 1968 to 72 and beyond, in terms of rebellions and policing. Are there other things that you discovered in the course of that you think we really need historians to go back and look at this too?
Yeah, I think the decade of the 1970s is difficult for us to confront, but it's really important. And, we have to ask, what happened exactly that left Black Americans much worse off at the end of the 1970s than they were in the beginning. And I think my work opens up new questions about how this externally directed collective violence, that is violence directed against the police, by the mid-1970s turned into a form of internal collective violence that often took the form of gang warfare. How did we get from the rebellions to gangs and the violent crime that did seriously increase through the decade? I think understanding the transformations of the 1970s is going to be really key to help us understand precisely how we got here moving forward.
And is that where you're going to be focusing next?
That's one of the areas.
All right. Next book. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Elizabeth Hinton's new book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s, is reviewed this week on the cover of the book review. Elizabeth Harris joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela.
So there were some terrible deaths this week.
There were. Oh, my God. So the beloved children's book author Eric Carle died this week at 91. He wrote The Very Lonely Firefly, The Very Busy Spider, and one of the biggest children's books ever, probably The Very Hungry Caterpillar. He'd written and illustrated more than 70 books for young kids, which sold more than 170 million copies. That is insane, by the way. And I have young kids, so if you would like me to recite The Very Hungry Caterpillar for you in my sleep, that won't be a problem. Happy to do it. And that book was published in 1969. And the other was Lois Ehlert, who also died this week. She was 86, and she wrote and illustrated Chicka Chicka Boom Boom, which I could probably recite not just if I were asleep, but if I were dead.
That book was written by Bill Martin Jr. and John Archambault, and she illustrated it. So she's not responsible for the text, but the text of that book gets in my head like nothing else. Do you have a whole rhyme to your reading? Because it's like chicka chicka boom boom.
That's not my, my
What's
rhythm
yours?
is different. I'm sorry. Chicka chicka boom boom. Will there be enough room? Here comes S and da 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 da.
Yes.
And it must be the same every time where the small children get upset. So there's no room for improv in this one.
I used to think that the kids get upset if I screw up my rhythm and my whole song, essentially, for some books. I came to realize after a while, your kids are still really young. I'm the one who gets upset if I screw up my rhythm. My kids didn't really care. And like, as they got older, they were kind of like, it's sort of annoying when you do that sometimes.
All right. Well, I'm going to run an experiment tonight and I'm going to change my song and I will report back.
Eric Carle actually also did some collaborations with Bill Martin, the Brown Bear, What Do You See? Which also, like, I can only say in a certain rhythm. And I do remember my daughter would get very upset if if a page stuck together and, like, if we missed, like, the wallow, which is what she called the water buffalo.
Oh. Yeah, my little one just turned 3, and sometimes if it's late, I'll like try and like stick 2 pages together and like just keep moving. He's no. There's no more of that. He's definitely beyond that. It's really
They will totally catch you out.
Absolutely caught every time.
Many of Eric Carle's books are still in the top 10 best-selling books among picture books. These books just continue to enchant readers.
Totally. I mean, like, I think when my older kid was born, who's 5, I think we got like 4 copies of Brown Bear, and 3 of The Hungry Caterpillar. I mean, totally unsolicited. Just everyone's like, these are my favorite books from childhood that I read to my child who's 10 or 40 or 3. And it's just, they're still absolutely everywhere. It's amazing.
All right, let's raise the age level here a little bit. You were also going to talk about a new novel for adults.
Yes. So next week, one of the most anticipated debut novels of the summer is coming out. It's called The Other Black Girl. It's written by Zakiya Dalila Harris. So this book is an indictment of the publishing industry and the superficial way that industry, like many industries, have commodified diversity and rather than making real substantive changes. But it's not a straight take on office politics. It's got like a horror twist to it. It's also funny, and it gives a perspective we haven't had all that much from within publishing because it's written by a Black woman from the perspective of a Black woman. And publishing, meanwhile, it remains extremely white. So Harris actually worked in publishing herself. She was an editorial assistant and then assistant editor at Knopf for a couple of years. And then she quit to write this book. And she had a really wild ride with it. She started writing the book in January of 2019. She finished it in 9 months, got herself an agent that fall. Then they started sending it out to publishing houses. And the interest in it was just crazy. 14 publishers bid on this thing. And Atrio, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster, eventually bought it for more than $1 million.
And if you don't like to read, it's going to be a TV show.
Exactly. It's being turned into a show with Hulu, and Harris is in the process of writing the pilot right now with Rashida Jones. And Harris, by the way, is only 28. Just putting that out there.
Just to make us feel bad. Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, no problem.
Joining us now, my colleagues John Williams and Greg Coles to talk about what we're reading. John, what are you reading?
I just finished something this week, Michael Hare's Dispatches, which is a book from 1977 about the Vietnam War that I've been meaning to read for, Pamela, you were saying you read it in the 1990s. I probably first knew of it and wanted to read it then. So I'm at that age where you're starting to think, I have to start reading these things or else I'm going to be 80 years old going, there are all these classics.
It's like when you go through your Vietnam War period.
Well, it's interesting because in terms of books, I never really went through a Vietnam period. I definitely did in terms of, movies and like essays and journalism. But I haven't read many book-length accounts, but I'm wondering if this will actually spur it very belatedly because, as you probably remember, even though you read it a long time ago, it's kind of an indelible read. I'm sure many people know of it. Michael Hare went to HERR, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, went to Vietnam in, I believe, 1967 to report on it for Esquire magazine. And Dispatches showed up 10 years later. It was published in 1977. And he talked a lot about how much trouble he had writing it and turning all of this into a book. It is very much of its time in the sense that there are new journalism flavors all over it. It's very voice driven. It's very much his maniacal, almost changing of tones while he's embedded with these troops. And it really captures the chaos of the war, the shuttling from place to place in helicopters and the everything that we've come to associate with Vietnam, the rock and roll and the drugs and the madness really of it and the lack of clear purpose, but also the bloodthirsty joy that some people found in it, the fear that most of them felt. And he captures all this in prose it's occasionally self-indulgent. It's an acquired taste probably, but incredibly poetic at times, really strenuously written, and I found never really let me go in terms of its grip. And it's funny because I've seen Hare talking in a couple of clips from a documentary that came out, I guess, about the war and about veterans. And he's just the most, at least in these clips, the most soft-spoken, sort of small, quiet guy. And, in the book, he adopts I don't want to exaggerate the machismo of it because it acknowledges, like I said, the fear, and it's obviously critical of the war and its purposes, but it also captures the humor among the troops and the camaraderie of it. And I think, as he says in the documentary, if war were just hell, if there were no other colors on the palette, I think he says, then we wouldn't keep doing it. So it's a very kaleidoscopic view of it, but there is a swagger to it. He doesn't use exclamation points the way Tom Wolfe does or anything. The voice is what drives it. I think that Robert Stone said that he, it's like the Ancient Mariner. He kind of grabs you and just doesn't let you go until he's done with the tale. And John le Carré called it the best book he'd ever read on men and war in our time. So it's got all the laurels. I think that it's probably dated a little bit in terms of the tone for someone who didn't live through or read a lot of stuff from the 60s and 70s, but I just found it unforgettable. I also read that apparently, after the book it was a huge success and people talked about it a lot. And Hare apparently eventually said, a lot of this is, if not outright fiction, a lot of it is combinations of people. And there's definitely a novelistic technique that also applies to the new journalism tag. And it's interesting because I always find, as long as I know that, I don't really care. I mean, if I were a scholar quoting someone in the book, I would be upset. But I think of Joseph Mitchell, and Vivian Gornick has admitted that some of her characters are composites. And I think some of the best quote unquote nonfiction is written by people who take that license.
What's your favorite Vietnam book, Greg?
The whole time that you're talking about this, I'm thinking of Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried, which came out far later. O'Brien served in Vietnam and was a writer even at the time, but he kind of sat and mulled this stuff. And I think The Things They Carried came out probably 15 years after Dispatches did. And also used this kind of meta fiction composite approach. It feels very real, but it's fiction. It's short stories that are all kind of linked and give you this sense.
I did read the Tim O'Brien book in college and loved it. And I actually just pulled it off the shelf because I figured it's probably time to dip back into it after reading this. So that's my one. I lied when I said I didn't read any Vietnam book.
You've read one, now two.
What are you reading these days, Greg?
I'm also reading a classic that probably I should have read a long time ago and am getting around to. It's The Emigrants by W.G. Sebald. It's not the first Sebald book that I've read. I read Austerlitz a number of years ago, but that was the only previous Sebald that I've read. And I read it in close conjunction with reading the only James Coetzee book that I've ever read, Disgrace. And because it was a long time ago, and because I read them in close proximity, I have this tendency to kind of blur them in my mind, although I know they're very similar writers in some ways. They're both writing about national complicity and history and memory, but they're also very different writers. I think that Sebald is a much kind of moodier and less clinical writer than Coetzee is. And there's this deep impressionism and haunted quality to his work. The term Sebaldian has become very prominent today because he's been a very influential writer on a lot of novelists now who are also looking at questions of memory and history and complicity. And so I see that term and I know what it means, but the fact is I'd only ever read Austerlitz. And so I set about to remedy that with The Emigrants, which is his third novel. It was published in German in 1992 and translated into English in 1997. It's the one that everybody says, oh, if you're going to read Sebald, you should start with The Emigrants. It's told in 4 chunks, increasingly long chunks, where the narrator of this book, like Rachel Cusk or a lot of Philip Roth, the narrator is a kind of conduit for other characters' stories. He's not telling his own story. Instead, he's encountering people and letting them tell their stories. And so what you're getting here is the stories of 4 different emigrants, each one consecutively longer. You get a doctor who has retired to Norwich, England, but is actually Lithuanian. You get a school teacher who is the narrator's favorite school teacher from his German childhood, who later in life commits suicide, as does the doctor in the first one. Suicide kind of runs through here as a theme. The third one, which is the one I'm reading right now, is the story of the narrator's own great uncle, who emigrates from Germany to America and becomes the butler concierge to a Jewish family there. I know from reading around the book that the fourth one is a painter, but I'm not in that section yet. Kind of at the hidden center of all of these stories, the thing that they're not looking at is the Holocaust and Germany's treatment of the Jews throughout the 20th century, but especially during World War II. And it's the kind of the brightness of the sun that you have to look away from. You know, I say I'm reading a classic that I probably should have read a long time ago. When you approach a classic and you think, oh, I'm filling in a hole in my reading knowledge, there's the risk that it will feel merely dutiful. And you get over that so quickly in this book. It's you just sink right in. It's deeply immersive, deeply enjoyable. There's a hidden humor just through the narrator's perspective. It does that thing that fiction does where it can introduce you to very eccentric characters and let you kind of goggle at them. So in the first one, there's a woman who is the housekeeper at this estate where the narrator is staying and where he meets the doctor that he's talking to. And that they catch just a glimpse of the housekeeper's room down in the basement, and it's filled with dolls. And the narrator says something about, you know, in the bed where she sleeps, if she even sleeps and doesn't stay up all night crooning to these dolls. And the housekeeper is a very, very minor character, but it shows the narrator's whimsy in his perspective, even in a book that is very death haunted and impressionistic and moody. It captures really a lot. It kind of circles around things. There are little echoes throughout. I think it's making me want to do a deeper dive into Sebald in general. He died too soon. I think he has like 5 or 6 books, but not a vast of work to make my way through. It also makes me want to return to Coetzee in a way, because again, I associate those writers with each other somehow in my mind, only because I read them near each other back in the day. And I've never done a deep dive on them. And they're both obviously major writers. So stay tuned for a future podcast. Pamela, what are you reading?
So I'm going to talk about the book that I'm in the middle of, and I will probably return to talk about it later on when I'm done with it. I'm actually interrupting my actual chronological order of what I've read because I have a few books that I read before this. But I think this is worth maybe talking about twice because I'm going to be very specific. I'm reading Victor Sebastian's Lenin. The subtitle is The Man, the Dictator, and the Master of Terror. It's an interesting subtitle to talk about at this halfway point in the book because he's essentially done nothing terrifying or terror-like yet. And we are, or I am, 300 pages in. And
Wow.
because the revolution has not yet happened. And so it's an interesting point to kind of talk about what you learn about Lenin before the revolution. So this biography came out in 2017, and Sebastian was a podcast guest at the time. It's really a journalistic kind of political biography. It's not a deeply psychological portrait. You don't really get, or at least not for me, I have not yet gotten a sense of like, who is this guy other than an incredibly petty, ill-tempered, intemperate man who he's the kind of person that...
It sounds like you're getting a pretty good sense of him.
Well, he's the kind of person that people at the time would have been like, that guy? That's the guy who did all of this? He's the one, just not the person that you would have suspected would have overturned this enormous swath of the globe and led to tragedy, terror, and horror to come for 100 years. This was not the guy that you would have suspected. And it is really interesting. At a few points, you do get some interesting psychological perspective. And it's those points that I would like to talk about. And in particular, about his response to the arts, in one instance, literature, and in one case, music. So the first is that Lenin was a huge fan of this novel called What Is to Be Done, which is such a funny title. The author was a man named Nikolai Chernyshevsky, and Lenin absolutely idolized Chernyshevsky, and everyone else knew that Chernyshevsky was a terrible novelist, including Chernyshevsky, who, he had no pretensions to great art, but Lenin would not hear of anything bad about Chernyshevsky. And I just have to read. He wrote him a fan note. Chernyshevsky didn't write back. But this is when Lenin is in Swiss exile. He was in exile in Europe for, a huge chunk of his life. I think it was about 20 years before the revolution. And he had a falling out with someone named Nikolai Valentinov, basically after Valentinov criticized Chernyshevsky as untalented and said the book was crude and pretentious, unreadable. So I'm going to read from the book. Lenin flared up. He sat up with such a start that the chair creaked under him. His face stiffened and he flushed around the cheekbones. This always happened when he was angry. Do you realize what you are saying? How could such a monstrous and absurd idea come into your mind? To describe as crude and untalented a work of Chernyshevsky, the greatest and most talented representative of socialism before Marx, I declare it is impermissible to call What Is to Be Done crude and untalented. Hundreds of people became revolutionary under his influence. He completely transformed my outlook. This book provides inspiration for a lifetime. So there you have Lenin, passionate defender of a bad novel. And then here later on, he is talking about Beethoven. So apparently Lenin liked to pass a fine evening singing old Russian folk songs and revolutionary hymns, but he also really enjoyed listening to classical music. So I want to talk about his response to listening to a sonata by Beethoven. I know nothing greater than the Appassionata. I always think with pride what marvelous things human beings can do. But I can't listen too often. It affects your nerves, makes you want to say stupid, nice things and stroke the heads of people who could create such beauty while living in this vile hell. And you mustn't stroke anyone's head. You might get your hand bitten off. You have to hit them over the head without any mercy. Our duty is infernally hard. So I love that idea that he cannot live to, listen to Beethoven lest it make him too soft. So I will leave you there on the eve of revolution, and I will likely return to this in a few weeks. The review of this book in our pages likened it to a thriller, where it just the pacing, but we're not quite there yet. This is kind of the long run up to the revolution, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when Lenin, who seems very much an unlikely revolutionary leader, comes to power.
We'll be here for the sequel.
Let's run down the books again. John?
I read Dispatches by Michael Hare.
I'm reading The Emigrants by W.G. Sebald.
And I am reading Lenin, the Man, the Dictator, and the Master of Terror by Victor Sebastian. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.